I think episode 2, when we talk about our family's politics within the Spanish Civil War, the emotional twists and turns are really there. I think this is the episode where I remind you that I threw Peter Carroll's book on the Abraham Lincoln Brigades across the room in horror when I learned, simply on paper, of the incredible death tolls on the International Brigade side and the killing fields, really, of 1937.
Well, the phrase that was used very often was shock troops. And the Internationals, because of their political commitment and because of their willingness to take discipline and because of their willingness really to give their lives, were too often used as shock troops. That is, being thrown into the battle with very little training, very little weaponry, and a sense that, to some extent their lives were expendable. Yeah. And this was something that created a lot of anger, a lot of pain, and I don't think it's possible to understand it without digging deeply into the sort of political commitment these folks had as part of a larger global struggle against fascism.
In my discussion of what I call kitchen table history, I've been struck by this kind of tension between the sort of great worth of kitchen table history, by which I mean the things that all of us learn, or most of us learn, over the kitchen table, in conversations in the home, and the importance of those in terms of being an alternative, or in addition to what people learn about history in the classroom, on television, in the mass media, and so on. And so that's very important. But the flip side of that, which I only really began to think hard about when I got into this whole project, is the silences that exist. That is, the things that people do not want to talk about, and the sort of reality that historians like you and I have to deal with, which is not just stamping our foot and complaining about that, but trying to understand what it is. And, the more you think about it, certainly in my family, the more you realize that there's a lot of stuff that people, it's just too painful for people to talk about, or just it's been buried. There's also the motive, which was certainly true, I think, in my family, of trying to protect children and grandchildren from the truth, because the truth was so awful. And that's certainly something that I've, come to realize and think more about.
Yeah.
So in some respects, you have to honor the silences, you have to honor the pain, and you have to try to, in some ways, also think about your own life and ask yourself, are there things that I hid from my kids, or are there things that I am, not comfortable talking about, or just don't want to, and this ties into something else, a larger theme for me, which is the incredible changes from generation to generation over the quality of life and what people did to survive.
The risks they took,
And when I think about what my grandparents did, coming from Ukraine and the other side coming from Hungary, the choices they made, the decisions they took, and the lives of their kids, which were entirely different, and then the lives of of their grandchildren, which is me, in this case, and you. It's just a mind blower to me. It still is, how much things have changed. Now, that's of course not true for a lot of families, especially non-immigrant families. I mean, I'm always thinking about these people, in the Midwest or whatever, where they're 8 generations of people on the same wheat farm, whatever, I mean, where is that world? It's not a world that I'm familiar with, And again, it's not a question of making invidious comparisons. It's just recognizing these differences. And so the things that people went through, whether it was emigration from, in my case, Eastern European countries, um, the brutality and horrors of the Spanish Civil War, um, before that, the fleeing of anti-Semitic pogroms and so on, the struggle in the United States just to make a living, particularly during the Depression.
Right.
The whole question of how the children of immigrants become, I hate this term, Americanized, but
Right.
there's something real there. When people start going to public schools in New York City and they start becoming familiar with popular culture and learning how to be Americans, not just learning English, but also just what it is to be American.
Right.
It's an extraordinary leap from the world of their parents who were just trying to survive and also, make a better life for their kids, at least make
Yeah.
a better possible life for their kids.
Right. Well, yeah, I
and then
mean,
we come,
what our
just to finish, and then we
Yeah.
come to our generation, my generation. When I look at what my parents went through and struggles they had economically, politically, in other ways, socially, it's a different planet than the one I grew up on. So each of these generations, it seems to me, inhabits, a different planet, and yet the connections are also real. It's not really another planet, but it can sometimes seem that way. So
Yeah.
let me stop there. Let you jump
No. I think that's beautifully stated. And I think our last conversation helped crystallize for me the way my Spanish relatives have kind of projected onto my mother's immigration story in the 50s, this in search of the American dream.
Yeah.
When in fact, the story she told me, and certainly the research I've done on my Spanish family, especially the family in Pueblo Nuevo in the mining town, is that, the Spanish Civil War really, really broke her family, and that her departure was, not just a painful loss for her parents. She was the oldest daughter, but galling politically for her dad, who was an anarchist and was kind of cornered into failure, right? He couldn't feed his family. And so in order for my mother to leave the country, she actually had to sort of abide by the regime's rules. She had to get an ID card and go through indoctrination and some scary things, being surveilled. So what you're describing is this sort of this breakage, this breakage across time and place, across the generations, that only retrospectively sometimes gets the folklore of the American dream. And so I think in my book, I don't directly tackle that, but I try to explain. I'm seeking an explanation for this breakage, this intense breakage in my mother's family, and the key to that story is her great-grandfather, who was a high-placed functionary in the city, in town hall in Pueblo Nuevo, this prosperous mining village. And like you're saying, the key to his story, like some of your relatives, is silences. This is a man who looms so large in our family folktales, but they're mostly stories about his absence. So his presence is really absence. And so they tell stories about, the official story of the family is that Jose Becerra, my great-grandfather, was absent from the village during the Civil War. That's the official family story. Found that not to be true in my research. I've tried to explore his employment at town hall. Was turned down twice for documents. They literally dangled the folder in front of me. Jeez. They won't let me read it. So there's that there's that silencing. There's that sort of roadblock in the archive. And then, of course, the third thing that mostly gets talked about in my family is my great-grandfather, Jose, had a second family. The reason why he was never home is that he had a mistress and a natural child in the town next door, which was a family secret of sorts, but it was an open secret. You just couldn't talk about it.
You understand the silence is there, huh?
Right. And particularly, I think the silences have been around protecting my great-grandmother's feeling of injury and shame that she had to navigate very delicately in a Catholic context. So, I think I might have a little different approach in the sense that I have begun to crack open some of these silences, but with a very mindfulness about not overly exposing the carefully protected strategies for, the dignity, right? The dignity of a wife who was largely powerless, right, in her world. And so it's a delicate dance. It's just a very, very delicate dance.
Well, in generational terms, the character that I want to talk about a bit, Ben Barsky, is a little closer to me in the sense that he was my mother's brother, but of course I never got to meet him. And growing up, he was a presence only in his absence, as you suggest. And I knew that he was my mother's brother. He was the oldest son. There were 5 kids. And the historical record is largely mute about him, as it is for so many people who went to Spain from the United States and from other countries in international brigades. All anybody knew when I was growing up, or all I ever heard, was that Ben Barsky had left for Spain in 1937 as a young man, maybe 21 years old, and he did not return. The family never received any sort of confirmation, official or otherwise, as to his fate. And in this respect, again, his story resembles that of hundreds of others. There just are not, there was no way to know what happened because, as you know, it was illegal for Americans to go to Spain because of the Neutrality Act. And those people that did volunteer to fight in the international brigades from the United States and other countries as well had to, follow the circuitous route to Spain, which often meant first going to France and then, hiking over the Pyrenees and finally getting to Spain. Along the way, it's clear that they had a lot of help from politically simpatico people, both in France and Spain, people who supported the Republic, people who might have been socialists or communists or anarchists. At any rate, all I knew was that I had this uncle. He was killed in Spain, presumably, and that you couldn't talk about it.
Right.
And several times as I got to be a teenager and I was sort of inquisitive and already, interested in family history, my mother said to me, "Look, don't ask Grandma about Uncle Ben." And again, I had to honor that, and I couldn't, sort of break that silence there. And the first breakthrough for me came in 1967, 68. I was a freshman in college. I was home for some holiday. I went to a bookstore with my dad, and I was looking around at books, and I found this new book that just came out by Arthur Landis, who was himself a veteran of the Lincoln Brigade, and he wrote this book called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, which was really the first comprehensive, serious attempt at a history. Big fat book, about 600 pages.
Wow.
And I saw this book, and just on a whim, I looked in the index, and I found this entry, Ben Barsky, Death of. And I quickly turned to the thing. I'm standing in the bookstore with my dad, and what I found was a brief entry that was made by a guy named Sam Nauman, who himself was 19 years old. And he provided this brief eyewitness account of Ben Barsky's death. And I'll just read you a little piece of what I saw.
Wow.
This was during the time of the Ebro campaign in the summer of 1938, the last gasp, really, of the Republic, in an attempt to have a counteroffensive against the fascists and their German and Italian allies. Anyway, there in Atlantis's book, this is like 1967, 68, I found the following. He was talking about the futility of an assault by an undermanned and heavily outgunned, the Republican forces, which was typical war. He said the following: "Well, we should not have attacked. Company after company went into action there. It was futile. Rose was killed there, and Ben Barsky and many others. The top of the hill was fortified. Their base was too. It should have been shelled. One battery, and we could have had it." And that was it. In other words, this is a diary entry written in haste, but there's Ben Barsky. So I finally said, well, he was killed there. Showed it to my dad. We bought the book, showed it to a couple of other family members, and that was, all I had. Subsequently, I did a lot more research and I was able to find out more. But that was really sort of the beginning of it. And I was later able to put together some pieces. I'll stop here. You can jump in if you
Oh,
like.
it's such a powerful story. That moment of discovery, and I've had little teasers, but nothing. I had little teasers, and then I've had a big reveal. So it's going to be, I think, a good match today. My tiny little scraps from family about Jose Becerra, who's alive when your uncle's alive. They occupy the same frame, at least for a little while in their lives. It's really kind of extraordinary. I know he was born in 1885 in Fuente Ovejuna, made famous by the playwright Lope de Vega's play.
Mhm.
I know he's the son of a pig herder. This is rural living. This is a very undeveloped environment, full of agricultural workers and herdsmen. But eventually, Jose entered the mines. My great-grandfather entered the mines, became a mine worker, and somehow scratched out an education for himself. And one of the family stories has to do with the very kind of beautiful set of leather-bound law books that this man managed to buy and study, and sort of an autodidact. He was sort of self-taught.
Yes.
Yeah. So he kind of scratched his way to reinvent himself. And apparently there's also little snippets about his father not being very keen on this, because he's losing a provider, right? He's losing
Right.
part of the worker.
So it wasn't that he went to school, it was more that he was autodidact.
Exactly. Now his wife, Anna, never learned to read or write. And it's very interesting because my mother's sister lived in this house for over 10 years during the Hunger Years in Spain. And she always talks about the two rooms that are constantly commented on in family lore is my great-grandfather's despacho, his home office, because not only was he a government functionary, but he had a law practice in his home. People came and saw him. He was, he had a side hustle, if you will. And so his despacho at home, and then my grandmother's space was always the larder, where they kept all the food, and it was under lock and key, because remember, these were tough years, a lot of hunger in the 30s and 40s and into the 50s. And of course, the despacho and the larder, my great-grandfather's space and my great-grandmother's space are connected, because often the people who came to Jose for help paid him in food, paid him in chickens, paid him in sausage and morcilla.
Water economy.
Yeah. And so, Jose's job was to get the assets, and Anna's job was to guard them under lock and key in the larder upstairs. And my mother's sister has stories about sort of standing at her side as she's counting all the supplies up there, right? And my great-grandmother was illiterate, so she used to use garbanzo beans that she would keep in a row for every 10 count, right, of whatever she was doing. And so this is the structure of this household, and it's all through family memory. And there's some inequality there, right? My great-grandmother couldn't read or write. My great-grandfather was a big shot. But really, what I have no records of his words in these early days before the war. Just little snippets in the newspapers, little scraps. He's always referred to with the honorific Don Jose. And so he's given some respect. He's never elected to anything. He's always called like the first executive, or the first official. That's the phrase they like to use in the media to describe who he is. But he's never really elected to anything. They mostly talk about him coming in and out of hotels. He travels around a lot. Again, this is the absence factor in the family story. But he was also a rough guy. I found little crime reports where he would slam a neighbor in jail for insulting him in the street. He was himself tossed in jail for fighting, for basically punching people around.
He was a minor.
And the visual record of this man is he is a sort of glowering, big, strong individual, whether he's dressed up in his Sunday best or whether he's out on a picnic with his brothers. They did a lot of hunting. So he's a towering figure, and yet he's this dominant presence, and yet I don't really get his words till after the war. And I have some more stories, but I'll stop there.
Well, I think the education thing is interesting too, especially because I mean the whole autodidact tradition on the left, in particular in the United States, is very, very strong. But Ben Barsky. So I found out where he was killed, but I really didn't know anything else. Why did he volunteer to go to Spain? What happened to him over there? And then I gradually began to be able to piece together some things. He was the eldest son of a family, as I suggested before, that had fled an anti-Semitic pogrom in the summer of 1919 in the town of Lysyanka near Kiev. And it was not until much later, even, simple things. What was the town that they left?
Right.
I didn't learn that till much later. Where was my mother born? Uh, all I ever heard was that
Wow.
she was born in Poland. Well, I thought that they were in Ukraine and they came to Ellis Island. Well, it turns out that they wandered around for several years, and
Wow.
it took them 4 years to get to Ellis Island in 1923.
Right.
At which point, my grandparents were middle-aged, 37, 36 years old, and they had five kids between the ages of 11 and 1. My mother was about a year and a half, an infant. She had been born in Poland, although I still don't know exactly where. Um, and Ben was listed as 5 years old, which means he would have been born in 1917. I think he was probably a year or so older than that. Anyway, the family settled in the East Bronx where they opened up a small fish store. My grandfather had been a leather trader, a man of some means in the Ukraine, and uh, but Ben's political awakening, as best I could tell, came as a student. The
Yeah.
family really valued education. He graduated from James Monroe High School in the Bronx, which is itself was an achievement. And then he attended City College, which was, of course, a hotbed of political
Right.
activism in the early and mid 1930s. He probably participated in various student protests against mandatory ROTC classes and in favor of freer political expression on campus. This is something people take for granted today, but back then, there was no real free speech.
Yeah.
Like most campuses, there was a real strict rules about students demonstrating and petitioning and so on. At any rate, Ben, didn't graduate from City College. I'm not sure. I think he was there for a couple of years. And then he joins the Young Communist League. And one of the things that I found only after doing this research, I mean, he began organizing, as best I can tell, white collar workers on Wall Street.
Wow.
And many years later, in 1989, I connected with a guy named Irving Weissman, who was also a Lincoln vet and had traveled actually to Spain with Ben Barsky. And it was Irving Weissman's wife, Frida Weissman, who wrote me this beautiful handwritten note because Irving had told me, my wife knew your uncle. And I said, really? And so I got this letter in 1989, which I'm going to read from, if that's okay.
Oh, wonderful.
Because this is really the most fully human portrait I ever got of my Uncle Ben. And this is Frida Weissman writing or recalling 50 years later, and it gives a kind of snapshot of what they did and also his personality. She says, we were a cell of the Communist Party, composed of people who worked in and around Wall Street. We were busy trying to form a union. We juggled party cell offices among ourselves. And as we were not a union yet, we just considered ourselves to be an organizing committee for a long time. We tried to recruit for both the party, the Communist Party, and the union. We issued leaflets, and we had a little printed paper called Wall Street Forum. And Frida was the editor for a while. Ben
Wow.
Barsky worked. They would distribute leaflets on 23rd Street to garment workers. And the Wall Street Forum, this paper they worked on was a small printed periodical, what they called a shop paper. Ben and I, she says, worked on this paper. All positions and assignments were juggled because, time, energy,
Pitch in
health,
where you could.
other
Yeah.
obligations. That's right. And she says, as you can tell, I remember Ben very well. He was what is known as a pure soul.
Oh,
He was
my.
a very gentle, sweet, and modest person, bright, dedicated, and extremely able. He was also very handsome. It is strange to be writing about him after all these years. I cared for Ben, and truth to tell, he is one of my treasured memories. Sounds like she might have been in love with him to me.
Oh, it's lovely.
But it hardly sounds like somebody ready to pick up a gun. I
Yeah.
mean, the guy was educated. He was a college student. He was, I think, more of an idealist than an aspiring intellectual because he read deeply, apparently. He read widely in fiction and history. He loved to sing. He might have had some musical ability too. And he also had some knowledge of Spanish. So in May 1937, Ben volunteered and left for Spain.
Wait, how did he learn Spanish? How did he know Spanish?
I think he learned. I think he took Spanish lessons at City College. I think.
Oh, no me diga. Wow.
So
That's
he
cool.
wasn't fluent, but he had some knowledge of it. And he goes to Spain in May 20th, 1937, with 29 other Americans who were being watched, by the way, all the time by the American council. They had sort of they were spying on these guys. Basically, they were considered suspicious because they were in England, Liverpool. They claimed to be tourists en route to Paris. There was always some subterfuge because you weren't allowed to go.
Right.
His occupation, he was listed as age 22, and his occupation was student. He may also worked as a teacher in New York before he left. Quite sure about this. At any rate, in 1977, my grandmother, his mother, did an oral history with a cousin of mine, an oral history, a tape that was lost for 40 years. And it wasn't until 17 that I found this tape.
Amazing.
And one of the things in the tape is that, his mother, Miriam, my grandmother, recalls him this way. She says, he was the best looking boy in the family. He was quiet. He had curly hair. And then she says, and I'm quoting, he loved me so much. I could never understand why he went there to get killed. She blamed his time at CCNY, mostly full of communists, she said, and they talked him into it. And she asked in the tape, how can a boy serve who never had a gun in his life? And he obviously had become a communist. She and her husband, my grandfather Sam, had no use for communists. They had blamed the Bolsheviks for expropriating his Sam's leather trading business and confiscating their money back in Ukraine. It's a complicated story. I'm not quite sure of all of it because my grandfather also served in the Russian army. Larger point of interest to me is that in their view, their oldest son had somehow in America now been seduced by communists,
right?
To go to Spain. He told his parents nothing except that he was going to have, again, my grandmother says, some fun.
Wow.
And she remembered bitterly, really what kind of fun. And she suspected that her sister Rose, my great aunt Rose, and her daughter, my aunt Esther, both active communists at the time, knew about Ben's plan and possibly encouraged him to go. So I think there was some tension, although they both denied it. Ben's younger brother, my Uncle Sidney, who was 17 at the time, did not want his brother to go. And he advised his father, my grandfather, to have Ben arrested to prevent his leaving.
Oh my God. Yes. Amazing.
But my grandfather was worried that, making trouble might get them deported back to Russia. So they didn't do anything about it. Wow. But here was a whole other angle here, which I think has been largely neglected, but sort of underplayed in all these stories of the heroism, which was real, the idealism, which was real, and the sacrifice, which was real, that these people made going to fight in Spain. And that is the impact on the relatives, in this case, the mother. And, there's an old joke that the vets used to tell that these guys, young guys at 20, 21, 22, they were not afraid of Franco. They were not afraid of Hitler or Mussolini, but they were afraid of their mothers. They couldn't tell them the truth about what they're doing. Right?
Amazing. I mean, such a stark portrait, such a beautiful and stark portrait. I mean, as he's heading to Spain, as Ben is heading to Spain, my great grandfather, they're in the same frame. It couldn't be more starkly different. First of all, his politics are camouflaged in a different way. No one's talking. It's clear that he is brought into City Hall in 1934 in early October as part of the prep for the general strike, because the Republic is in place, but they're bracing after the 1933 elections for reaction, for insurgency. Right. And, my great grandfather, he was the fixer. He was the guy you go to. I know a guy, and that was my great grandfather, Jose. So he's brought into City Hall in 1934, and he doesn't leave for 20 years because he's the fixer. And unlike your gentle, highly educated relative, my great-grandfather was known, as my aunt said, he hit everybody. But managed to, for all his strength, he managed to stay out of the war itself. He never did combat, but he hit everybody. And the memory also is that he carried a heavy cane with a big brass knob on the end. And, the family always remembered him as having this elegant, heavy cane. But sort of digging around, I think it was really that he carried the baston de mando of City Hall. It's like a gavel, except it's a club. It's basically a club. And, like the gavel keeps order, whoever carried the baston de mando kept order in public meetings. And so, he was a violent man, and he was sort of lightly armed at all times. He may have had a gun. That has not come through. But, one of the things that has been preserved is the heavy-handedness of his household and his family life and the violence of that family life. And the one of the major stories of a man who was always, mostly absent when he was around, it's almost a cartoon, a caricature of how violent he was. And one of the iconic outbursts happened probably just at the opening of the 30s, because Anna and his youngest daughter was going to school. They had 4 children, and in this outburst, he actually trashed his own house by way of disciplining his wife. So what had happened was, as their youngest of 4 children is going off to school, to a private Catholic academy where the sort of upper crust sent their children in the mining village of Pueblo Nuevo, my great-grandmother Anna learns that her husband's out of wedlock daughter will be in their daughter's class. And she's mortified. And the story goes that, here's a woman again who's not terribly educated, doesn't read or write, but knows that this is a great indignity for her legitimate child to be sitting next to this natural child that Jose has had with this other woman. So she goes to the school, and she marches into the classroom and tells the nun to throw this child out, of the other woman. And goes back home. And when Jose comes home for lunch, he takes this baston, he takes his cane. And, the big midday meal, right, in a Spanish household, in the comedor, in the dining room, everybody comes home, and it's the most formal meal of the day. So the table would have been set for 6 or 8 people. There were 3 servants in the house. And he takes his cane and he starts trashing the china, the lamps, the glassware, upending the furniture, trashing the chairs, turns everything over. And there's my great-grandmother sort of cowering in shock, and then whips out a wad of cash and throws it on the ground and says, "Now buy a whole new set."
Something out of The Godfather.
My aunt would have heard it from Luisa, who was the daughter who was in school with this other half sister. Right. Wow. So, the point is that he ruled by violence. And though my great-grandmother tried to use her voice, she had it quashed, and while it was not unusual for high status men to have mistresses, maybe then or now, certain secrets were supposed to be kept unspoken, and certain unwritten rules were observed. And one of those was that a man came home for dinner every day, and that you also came home to die. So this sort of ties back to your losing your relative with no information. But Jose actually died in the house of his mistress, which you're not supposed to do. You're supposed to come home. You die in your wife's care. And so, sadly, my great-grandmother had to bear that additional shame at the end of his life in the 50s, because he deprived her of that dignity, right, of presiding, over his death. And so these are tough stories, just very tough stories.
Well, you obviously have done a tremendous amount of digging into this, as I have as well. And I think of this piece by piece. I mean, I finally figured out, starting when I was 17 or 18, where this guy was killed. Then I found out a little bit about what he did, as a student, and then I had this letter from this woman who I think was in love with him, Frida Weissman. Then I finally heard the tape of my grandmother's bitter memories of his going, something she never sort of forgot, and I think the pain was with her all her life, especially as the oldest son. But I wanted to keep going, and I did.
Yeah.
So, well, okay, what did he do in Spain, and what was his record there? What was he known for?
Yeah.
And little things began to make sense and come through. So you may know that the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, which was the first group of Americans that went over, was pretty much decimated in the Battle of Jarama in February 1937. I mean, it was really. Um,
I do know
people,
that. I think I've told you that I threw the book across the room the first time I read that. It's wrenching. It's
the
horrifying.
phrase, the phrase shock troops is really apt for these guys are cannon fodder. I mean, they just put them on the line. Some of them had just, come in a couple of days before wearing sneakers. I mean,
Yeah.
most of them had never fired a gun in their lives. At any rate, after the devastation at Harama, the Americans were reorganized, and that's why we talk about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. People say, well, it was a battalion, but what it means is that after the Lincoln Battalion was pretty much wiped out, they created the so-called George Washington Battalion, and then
really?
they created. Yes, then they created what was called the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, which was supposed to be Canadians, but actually they had more Americans than Canadians. And the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion in the summer of 1937 was where Ben Barsky wound up. And the training there, they wanted to train them better. They wanted to they tried to learn the lessons of the disaster of Harama. And the main the commander at that point was a guy named Robert Merriman, who became a lieutenant colonel and took over the training. And Merriman's personal diaries have recently been translated, and I'm sorry, I should say transcribed. They're written in English. And Merriman, in those diaries, I found a couple of references to my uncle, and it's sort
Amazing.
of interesting. He said in his personal diary in 1937, Merriman noted that he had, quote, much trouble with the talking of Ben Barsky. And he shortly thereafter, he reported that Barsky is now a commissar at the auto park, and so it's so interesting that on the one hand, I think that Merriman probably disliked him because he talked a lot. And you can imagine how some of the other men who had been through battle and had seen a lot of terrible stuff. Barsky may have come across as very bright and eager, but too much of a talker. And remember, most of these guys had not graduated from high school, much less gone to college. So here's a guy who's sort of educated. And although Merriman doesn't seem to have liked him, he trusted him with special assignments. And I think this is partly because he was more educated. So, for example, there was a convoy of trucks with tons of supplies from that failed to show up, excuse me. And so he sent Ben Barsky and two other trusted men to Valencia to find out what happened.
Wow.
And it also landed him behind the lines. And so in the fall of 1937, he enlisted as a soldado in the quartermaster, the kitchen administration, cocinas and intendencia unit. And after that, he became what they call a comprador, a purchasing agent, presumably negotiating with locals and the brigade staff for food and arms and other supplies. I found a memo that chastised him for crashing a van. He had not learned how to drive back in the Bronx. And here he is driving a van.
Oh my gosh.
So as I said, he I think came across as a very bright, eager, but perhaps too much of a talker, and that's familiar in my family. And by the summer of 1938, he'd been promoted to a cabo, a corporal, but still working in the quartermaster side thing. So my sense is that he had kind of a behind the lines job based on his education and based on his the fact that the guy could was more highly educated than most of the other units. But in the final brutal campaign of the war, the Battle of the Ebro, everyone became a frontline soldier. So I was able to find out this stuff about him, which sort of fit in with what I thought I understood, namely that this guy was a kind of intellectual or aspiring intellectual. Um, he was not somebody who came from a kind of, working class background, working
Right.
as a furrier or as a steel worker or whatever. He was something different. Uh, but the education piece is so crucial here.
Yeah.
And so I'll stop there. Let you
Well,
jump in.
amazing stories. This famous library that my great grandfather kept in his despacho, in his home office. They eventually, when he died, they had to sell it off, and they were, because they needed money, and the family needed money. And part of why they needed to raise this money is that he actually recognized this daughter that he had fathered with his mistress. And so these images of the power of learning, the power of books,
Yeah.
the economic value of learning and education and knowing how systems work, because this guy was a fixer and he knew how things should and shouldn't go, and knew how to shade it to one side or the other. I mean, I think that's why he is so durable. He was so durable at City Hall. There was a socialist mayor after he was appointed to this position in the early 30s, and he stuck through regardless of regime change. People found him useful. So I guess the two things I'll just share about what his wartime career, which is what you shared so pointedly about Ben, is clearly he was in the neighborhood. I've got news clips that say, "Oh, Don Jose just checked into this hotel," or we just bid him a fair farewell from the Capitol. And in 1937, one of the newspapers that is bidding our dear friend a fond farewell from the Capitol is the Falange. This is showing up in Azul, which is the fascist party's newspaper in Cordova City. So he's there, and he's on, not the side, right, of the Republic.
So by that time, he's with the Falang.
He is.
Is the implication, yeah.
Yeah, and so I just found that a couple months ago. I hadn't quite pinned that piece down, but my big aha moment about my great grandfather's role in the war actually came in my research trip. I was in Madrid. I was in the Ministerio de Fomento, which is essentially the economic development, ministry of the Spanish government. And I was looking at the records of a cooperative housing project that was funded. The law was passed in 1911. It really became a big thing in the 20s. It finally got properly funded under the earlier authoritarian dictatorship of Primo de Rivera, and the miners of Pueblo Nuevo get behind this in the 20s, and they end up building 100 units of housing based on this project. So I was in the Ministerio de Fomento files records looking for the fingerprints of the workers' cooperative. And so I'm going through and I had a gold mine. I'm going through all these papers, and all of a sudden I finally see a piece of paper with my great grandfather's name at the very top line. Again, all I've seen of this guy is all just flickering, like just flickers in the media. And I can't find his voice. I don't know what he really stands for, but he's a fixer. So he's going to keep it behind the scenes. But anyway, finally I find this document, and his name is at the top of the top line name on this 15-page document. And what it is a seizure document that from November of 1939, in which all the, quote, property and assets of the cooperative Casas Baratas, cheap housing, were seized under the law of political, quote unquote, responsibilities passed in September, as the nationalists, as Franco's forces sort of overrun what's left. Overrun the last bit of resistance. In fact, the Battle of the Cordova Front is one of the last gasp contests in January. It's one of those terrible draws where nobody really wins or gains any territory, and there's a lot of bloodshed, but no real victory on either side. But and in this long document, his voice is sort of formulaic, but he not only, his name is typed as I, Jose Becerra, therefore, affirm the following, right? His signature is on it, the seal of the city hall.
It's like a deposition.
Yeah, and it's sort of like putting the fig leaf of legitimacy over the appropriation of this housing. And it was sobering. I mean, I guess it could have been worse, but it really underscored where my family, that side of my Spanish family,
So
stood.
is it fair to say that he was he became like a kind of local representative or fixer, as you say, to essentially grease the wheels for the appropriation of these houses?
Exactly.
Right.
And then the
Wow.
next document is an acclamation by the few remaining residents. I mean, one of the things my book shows is that most people prevented the Franco's forces from really cashing in on this very well-appointed mining town by actually abandoning the village. Again, we're back to Lope de Vega. And by abandoning the town, they deprived the nationalists of getting anything out of it, right? If workers, no coal, no electricity.
Right.
So there were very few people left actually in the Casas Baratas, in the housing neighborhood where this was built in the 1920s. And so it was only about 15 people signed in this, very poignantly wobbly handwriting, including one woman. So it's not clear what they really exited people at gunpoint, and probably most residents had left by then. But nonetheless, my grandfather was the one who, spoke on behalf of the invading forces to appropriate this hard-won housing built by mining families a decade earlier.
Well,
I got him anyway, but the short version is I found him in an unexpected place.
I know those eureka moments well.
Yeah.
They're too few and far between. I mean, for me, so I finally felt like I had a picture of Ben Barsky, who was a student, an idealist. I had a sense of the family, pain through my grandmother of his leaving. I also knew that he was a communist, and that, like most of the people that were volunteers, not only in the United States but around the world, that most of them were on the left. Many of them were communists. The international brigades were organized by communists. He was part of the Popular Front that had, sort of like decided to take a stand globally against fascism. So I had all that stuff straight, and I had a picture of him too as a guy who probably talked too much. Maybe was a little full of himself, and how I could see the resentment of people who had never gone to high school, much less college. But then what about his death? What about the battle? What about the actual fighting? And this turned out to be, in some ways, I mean, this was really the most brutal part of the story, because the fighting was so awful. And it was, after all this digging that I had done, that I got a picture of what happened. In the summer of 1938, the Republican government launched an offensive that was meant to stop the fascist drive on the Republican capital of Valencia. Valencia had become the capital during the war. It was aimed at that was aimed at cutting the Republic in half, which would have been the end of it.
Right.
So in late July, in 1938, you had this massive invasion in which the Republican forces crossed the Ebro, and Ben went across the Ebro with the MacPaps, the Mackenzie Papineau battalion he was with. And the troops made their way in rafts, rowboats, anything that could float. The idea was to get across the route as quickly as possible and then continue the offensive. And the Republican forces actually managed to open a large front, but they had only rifles and machine guns and grenades. And we took several towns, the town of Asco, captured prisoners and weapons. They went to the town of Cabrera. And then they moved toward Gandesa, which was a larger town. And of course, in response to this Ebro offensive, Franco ordered a devastating counterattack, which meant rushing fresh troops to the front, and of course, massive amounts of artillery and the latest weaponry, mostly from Germany. And as it had been the case throughout the war, the fascist advantage in weapons was a decisive factor. And you've got German Messerschmitt airplanes dropping bombs, Stuka dive bombers. You've got powerful 88 millimeter guns, artillery guns. And this is all a bloody preview of World War II, of course. I mean, and the Germans, in many respects, were trying these things out to see how they would work. And so I discovered that around the town of Gandesa, the Republicans went to try to take the town. And they got within a few hundred meters of the town before a heavy counterattack forced them to retreat. Basically, at Gandesa, the Republican troops needed to take a heavily fortified fascist controlled hill. They call it the Pimple, overlooking the town of Gandesa. And the men dug in as best they could. The slopes and the barrancas surrounding the hill, uh, rocky soil, trying to create some kind of cover with stones and earth. They're getting continually pounded by these fascist airplanes and heavy artillery, mortars. The British began a murderous assault up the hill, but they were repulsed. There were bodies all over the hillside. The summer heat soon produced really a ghastly stench from what everybody says. There were 550 British volunteers who crossed the Ebro. Only 150 of them remained. I mean, they almost wiped out. And so on August 1st, the Mac Paps relieved the British, tried to take this hill, the Pimple. And I went there to visit. And I had some pictures. You couldn't believe it. I mean, because the hill is there. And these people are trying to get up the hill, the Republican forces, and there's no cover. I mean, there's no trees, there's no, caves or anything like that. And they're out in the open. You got the stench of rotting corpses. You got screaming artillery shells. You got machine gun fire all around you. And the hill was never taken. And that diary entry I read before recounts how several people were killed in that attack. And then, again, almost like a fluke, I discovered a Spanish death certificate for Ben Barsky.
No.
Which lists the date of his death as August 10th. And so it seems likely that this guy recorded in his diary was August 1st. So I think what happened was that he was probably badly wounded, some kind of mortal wound, but he lingered for a few days. And before dying in a nearby dressing station, that building still stands, this with a farmhouse that they turned into a dressing station. I went there, I saw it, and just behind it is an unmarked grave of about 400 Americans, evidently. And I just heard from the popular memory group. I forget the name in Spanish. They're very active in Catalonia. They're doing all this DNA testing. They're trying to exhume graves, and they're telling me that if they can identify my uncle, they'll let me know. But that was his final resting place. But none of this was known by the family. This is all stuff I discovered through my research. So
that's incredible.
The brutality of the war, the actual conditions that people fought under. Forget about romance, forget about idealism, forget about all this stuff in movies and novels. And I would put a plug in here for Alva Bessie's classic book called Men in Battle. Alva Bessie, the great writer, screenwriter, and novelist who later was blacklisted as part of the Hollywood 10, was a veteran of this campaign. And that book is, I think, still the best account of what it was like to be on the ground, with the internationals in Spain, especially toward the end of the war in 1938. So Ben Barsky was part of that, lost his life there. And when you read these accounts of the battle, and when you actually go to see the terrain, as I did, it takes your breath away. How the hell did these guys think that they were going to win this thing? They didn't have the weapons. They didn't have the position. They didn't have the troops, but they fought on. And so it's heroic in some, almost a Homeric sense, but it is also tragic. For sure. So he dies in 1938. He's probably about 23 years old at that point.
Wow.
As I said before, although he was able to work behind the lines and he was working in the quartermaster group and he was negotiating, so at the end, everybody was on the front line.
Right.
There were no distinctions. Didn't matter if you went to college or, how smart you were out there. And, the war ended fairly soon after that. The international troops were withdrawn in September 1938. And the ones that survived came home. But many of them never came home, of course.
Right. Dan, your story of Ben's death is so sad. And the miserable odds that the Lincolns faced in battle and his painfully young age of death are just heartbreaking. As far as I know, I did not lose any Becerra relatives during the Spanish Civil War. However, their town, my family's town of Pueblo Nuevo del Terrible itself was a casualty of the firepower of and the military mismatch of the conflict that you described so well. Pueblo Nuevo was a working class mining town that consistently elected socialists and Republicans to city hall office. The Civil Guard was also loyal to the Republic in this area. So the town rallied to the defense of the Republic in July of 1936. Local men organized into a defense battalion called the Batallón Terrible. So they took the town's name as their own, as a sort of battle cry and identity. And the residents of Pueblo Nuevo might have been somewhat confident about their security due to the remote location of the town. Pueblo Nuevo is only about an hour in today's terms from the capital of Córdoba City to the south, but it is straight up in the mountains. And Terriblenses might have believed that their town was also relatively safe because it was such an industrial asset for whatever side controlled it. It had metal shops, trains, factories, and a pretty good hospital. So very soon that summer, the Batallón Terrible quickly left the area to reinforce, I should say, the Civil Guard at Pozo Blanco. Pozo Blanco was just to the east and was a major barracks and munitions, sort of depot of the Civil Guard. And later they were deployed south to a village called Villa Viciosa. This situation left Pueblo Nuevo itself, if not undefended, certainly underdefended. And on October 14th, 1936, the rebel forces descended into the area by airplane. As historian Francisco Moreno Garcia tells it, he's the closest scholar of the war in Córdoba province, the airplanes caught people off guard. But because of the reduced militarized state of the area, there was minimal firefight and relatively few casualties in Pueblo Nuevo. But after a day or so of active shooting, the town was essentially overrun by the nationalists and taken over at this very early date. Now, interestingly, Robert Capa and Gerda Taro, the storied photographers of the Spanish Civil War, had visited the Cordoba front just a few weeks earlier in September. And they took a number of photographs, including images of the International Brigade that was stationed there near the town of Granjuela. This brigade was the Chapafiev Battalion, which I believe was Russian. And interesting, I only learned about Capa and Taro in Cordoba when I took my kids and my niece to the Mexican suitcase exhibit at the International Center for Photography in New York in 2010 on one of our visits east. And at that exhibit, I saw these Civil War images that had taken place in the backyard of my Spanish family for the first time. And it was unforgettable. I was riveted, and I even shelled out for the 2-volume catalog for the exhibit, which, those things can be expensive, but it was worth every penny to me emotionally. And turns out I ended up using it in guiding my research. So in some ways, much later than you, I had a similar experience to your bookstore encounter with your Uncle Ben Barsky's name in Arthur Landis's book back in the 60s. Seems the early confidence about Pueblo Nuevo's security may have resulted in a strategic miscalculation at the outbreak of hostilities. Republicans and resistance fighters tried to take back the area twice during the war. The first time was in 1937 at Granjuela, and then very late at the Battle of Valsequillo in January 1939. And these towns are little tiny farming villages where actually Capa and Taro took most of their images. Just to the north of Pueblo Nuevo itself. They're kind of situated in the gateway through the mountains there, the Sierra Morenas. And I carry actually 2 family memories from the Battle of Valsequillo. One is from my mother's first cousin's father, my Tio Manolo, someone who I knew quite well and stayed in his apartment in Madrid for months when I visited when I was in graduate school. And my Tio Manolo was an older teen during the Battle of Valsequillo in the early winter of 1939, and he was sort of commandeered during the battle to carry wounded soldiers to the hospital in Pueblo Nuevo in those handheld litters. And he saw bloodied bodies up close that left an unforgettable impression and a memory that he shared with his children and with me. The other memory of the late battle of the Spanish Civil War is from my mother, who was not quite 4 years old in January of 1939 when that final Battle of the Cordova Front broke out. And she shared with me a dim memory of being sort of outside in the open air, and likely having to hit the ground for safety because they heard the beginnings of combat. And she told me she shared her memory of feeling the warmth of the earth on her face when she kind of hit the ground, and it was kind of a newly plowed field. And she just remembered the smell and the sensation of the warm earth as a relative covered her with their body for safety. So, I mean, I think as you've shared so eloquently, war brings fearful shocks to young minds, young memories that stick with people for a lifetime, and they stick with the people who carry those memories. And I think you and I, and of course your relatives as well, carry these aftershocks. These are things, these are encounters with history, right? That you don't just get over. They shape us in unexpected ways. And I think writing my book about this town, Pueblo Nuevo del Terrible, is my way of trying to make sense out of these memories, most of them sort of dim and broken. But they mark important losses. And in some ways, those memories are the only connection we have to these distant relatives who sort of loom large in family stories, but, mostly have no contact with or maybe even never met. So I think that's one of the power of our two projects and why I so really cherish this time to share some of this work with you and some of this research and memory work. It's so important.
A lot of what you've shown, I think, in your book and your work is how, Pueblo Nuevo is a kind of microcosm for the entire period, not just the war, but the politics, the mining, the divisions that took place. And that was true not just in Barcelona and Madrid, but, in all of these towns as well. One thing that 2 points I want to make is, one is that I sometimes imagine, well, suppose I had discovered all this stuff a lot earlier, and I'd love to share this with people in the family. I'm not so sure that people would want to read all this stuff. I'm not so sure that they would share my or your sense of, wow, this is amazing. I dug this stuff up. I was able to find it. I think a lot of them might want to say, well, I really don't want to know about that. Because of the personal connections. But the flip side of this is, I often ask myself, well, what is really the legacy of these people in Spain? The American volunteers I'm talking about, not the Spanish. And the physical courage is one thing. The political commitment is another. But there's also, I think, the whole spirit of internationalism, which I think is so powerful and which we could use more of today. In other words, the idea of these 40,000 people coming from all over the world, mostly divided by languages and national groups, all to defeat fascism, all with the same, they different politics, but there was that sense of a popular front, united front, and the importance of internationalism. And on the American side also, the commitment to racial equality, and the idea that, you had the first guy in history, American history, this guy Oliver Law, who briefly led the Lincoln Battalion before he was killed in action. First time in American history that an African American was leading white troops. They were mixed, but they were mostly white. And well, that never happened. And I think that, people like Celeria Key, who was an African-American nurse, who was a big part of the American Medical Bureau. Um, those two things, the internationalism, the commitment to racial equality, um, no matter what else you could say about the Spanish Civil War and the Soviet Union and all of this stuff, you can't you can't dismiss that and the importance of that, at least in my mind.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that was all very much on the minds of these guys. And it's Ben Barsky apparently wrote these beautiful letters from Spain. My mother said she remembered hearing them. And she was like 17 or 18 at the time, but I've never been able to locate those letters, so I don't have them. I do have letters from other relatives in Spain, which we'll talk about another time. But
Wow.
I did my best to fill in the blanks, so to speak, and but it's still heartbreaking and still fraught with all kinds of contradictory feelings about the family and what this guy meant, the sorrow and the silences, which I try my best to transcend, overcome.
So eloquently put. I mean, I think so. I agree. My family does not really want to talk too much about where Jose stood on these issues. I think I have some cousins are like, well, our family won the war. They say it very, ruefully, with the sense of a little bit of a shame, my aunt who grew up in that household, they never used the cartillas. They were untouched by rationing and some of this, horrible hunger and famine that stalked so many households. My mother and my aunt had two different childhoods. My mother was eating orange peels and potato peels. And my aunt said, "Oh, I remember my first communion because there were 6 cakes. There were 6 cakes from the best bakeries in town, and all the servants were running around." I mean, it's a very divided story, and
very divided society too.
Yeah,
I mean,
very, very divided.
In your family.
Yeah. Exactly, and just a footnote. I think my Jose's brother, Teodosio, arrived just 3 years before your parents in 1920 on Ellis Island.
You do this kind of research, Patty. I'm sure you feel the same way, and you get a new appreciation for the power of serendipity in history. And particularly when you talk about immigration, why did some people come and some people not? Why did this guy and she didn't, or whatever? And and no matter how many social scientific generalizations people try to make about this ethnic group or that group, it still comes down to individuals, and even within families, how different things can be.
Absolutely.